can I ask, and maybe it's still in the kind of rumination process, but when you're building a local commerce system on the rubric of, lineages, Black, brown communities, etc., how does that start to look different than commerce as most people understand it? Are there kind of tangible things you can point to so I can start to wrap my head around how that works, what it looks like? Because over the last couple of years, I've become a big believer in what Charlie Munger said, which is show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And so I'm wondering, is it just a matter of changing incentives, or is there something deeper that has to shift?
I think it's something deeper that has to shift, and I think you have these plant medicines experiences, and one of the things that you start to realize is, wait, if I live from a place of trust, of goodness, trusting in goodness, I become more creative. Things flow better, as opposed to if I'm living from fear and needing to control. Building off a statement you made about, generally speaking, globally, we've become much more wealthier as human beings, much less tied to basic level survival. However, in a city like Oakland, which is representative of many cities, we have this really big disparity of wealth between our, marginalized communities of color, where 80% of homeless people, of which there's now like 15,000 homeless people in Oakland, 80% are Black, many of whom lived here in Oakland growing up. What's happening is that there is a giant disparity in where the wealth is going to. And so even though those communities may have better services relative to other people in communities, there's a massive differential, right? So let's take the Black community in Oakland in terms of healthcare, or brown community in Oakland in terms of healthcare, access to good services, access to safe neighborhoods, good housing. Still a big struggle, education being the worst amongst those. Our educational system in these communities is horrible. Whereas the education in a wealthy community is, phenomenal. So it's that disparity that really is a big, big problem for humanity in general, because it's going to create more and more stress, more and more division, more and more need for controls, more and more incarceration. It's just not sustainable. So that's the problem with the idea that at the one fractal level, yes, things are getting better generally, but in another fractal level, they're getting worse. So if we look at Oakland with respect to healing, there are models, and I'll lift one up specifically since you asked for an example, coming out of Dr. Sean Jenright's work, where he describes persistent traumatic stress exposure. And he doesn't work with psychedelics, but he works with what's called the radical healing model, which is around particularly healing in the Black community. And he's well known. He's at San Francisco State University. So PTSD is different than PTSD, because PTSD is chronic trauma in your life nonstop. That's a different experience than an acute trauma experience, and it just creates a whole level of distrust about everything. And so how do you handle that? So he's come up with this whole model of healing that within community. So the radical healing model, which I think is a model example of how healing can happen in the psychedelic space. And by the way, CIIS, they have been receiving workshops from members from people in the Black community of Oakland who do radical healing models. And as I understand it, is one of the most popular workshops at CIIS for their psychedelic program. What it does is it says, let's start with information. Let's pull the community together. So 100 people go through our process, including young people. Again, this doesn't include psychedelics, but it can. And I'll show you how. So let's start with information, and then let's go from information. Now we take that and create education. So pamphlets and workshops and trainings. And then once we do the education thing, let's have a peak experience. Now it's sounding very familiar to a journey. Peak experience in the radical healing model might be you take families, you take them into the wilderness, and you talk about what happened to the Black community in the American experience, including slavery, the diaspora, the Black community, Tulsa, what happened in Tulsa, what happened with crack cocaine. And you basically just give a big bucket of truth over a weekend. And what it does is just creates this heavy, heavy experience that then has to be reconciled. So now you're seeing this is like a deep journey where you're like inundated with truth. And then you end that experience, that trip into the wilderness with, okay, now let's have a conversation as community about how we reconcile this with living well in our own communities today. And so you have that begins the reconciliation process. And then you go into integration, not just as the individual, but as community. And this is what's different than the psychedelic, therapeutic medical model, is integration happens on the community level. So, I'm Bob and I live in that community, and my parents, are no longer around, and I'm 19 years old and I don't have many job opportunities, and I've had a lot of violence. Where do I go? Right. So now I have this community I can be a part of. If you consider that within the context of a psychedelic experience, that feeling of being alone now that I've woken up, you're held in community. Mm-hmm. And then the last piece is reciprocity. So it's integration, then community integration, and then it's reciprocity. Now, how do I give back to those coming behind me? That's the healing process that we know well of in psychedelic space. They're doing it and have been doing it for 30 years in the Black community of Oakland in that format. But now some of the leaders who are taking adults through healing processes with psychedelics are using it to inform the entire psychedelic experience, so that people aren't left to feel alone and abandoned after they have that awakening moment with psychedelics. These are examples. So if you take that and you build commerce around that, you can start to imagine, okay, who's growing all these medicines? Where's the retreat centers? Who's paying for it? How much is being paid for the retreats? All these businesses that can begin to emerge just with that experience, introducing these plants. And I think we have a lot to learn, not just from the Black community, but from Indigenous community in urban and rural areas, and all communities, really. So in every community offering their own interpretation of some version of that based on their own community dynamics is what we have to learn from a bottom-up approach based in community. But again, it's just being comfortable with gray area, because it's all going to be fluid, dynamic, messy.